Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome here to the George Scott Robertson lecture in the Great Hall at Queen's tonight. And a very warm welcome to all our delegates tonight who are listening and participating online. So it's great to be back. It's great to see people physically and to have the opportunity to run a hybrid event here together in the Great Hall and also with our colleagues online. I would just like to say a few very brief words in relation to tonight's lecture and to George Scott Robertson. Now, in terms of reflection, here's some narrative in around the significance of George Scott Robertson, not just to Queen's University, but to Northern Ireland and much further afield in terms of the contribution he made to agriculture and to food at a global level. Now, George was born in Middlesbrough in 1893. He did a degree in agriculture at Durham University and then was head of chemistry at the East Anglia Institute of Agriculture. Now, I wonder what that is today in today's currency. And then he was appointed as lecturer in agricultural chemistry at Queen's University in 1920. Now, if we go forward and consider what happened next, he went forward and established the Faculty of Agriculture at Queen's University in 1924 and was appointed as Professor of Agricultural Chemistry and Dean of the Faculty, and also Senior Research Officer in the Ministry of Agriculture. So effectively a position that connected the university, so connected research, connected education into the department, the Ministry of Agriculture. And he needed access to research facilities that issues in around agriculture and land and livestock agriculture could be studied. So he established, in conjunction with others, including our partners here tonight, the Ulster Farmers Union, established the Agricultural Research Institute of Northern Ireland, and he became director of IRENI from 1924 through to 1948. A busy man. From 1933 through to 1948, he was the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture, before taking up a post which he held for 1 year, where he was seconded in to establish the Agricultural Production Division of the Food and Agricultural Organization, what we know as the FAO of the United Nations. So a very significant contribution to agriculture and to the food sector, both in terms of research, education, and in the science policy interface. And that's a tremendous legacy that he contributed to our society. And I'll just leave you with some thoughts in around what his vision was. A clear vision. He had a clear vision in around agriculture and where it fitted. Outstanding energy combined with personal modesty, humility, seeking to make a real difference for our society, for our people. And An abiding belief in the value of research has been absolutely critical to being able to address key challenges in agriculture in that big period from 1920 onwards. And absolutely recognizing that research, education, skills, and working together is critical to be able to answer some of these issues. And that just reminds me of the significance of partnership to be able to achieve that. And tonight, I'm absolutely delighted that tonight's event, the George Scott Robertson lecture, is delivered in conjunction with our partners at AFBI, the Ulster Farmers Union, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. And I'm delighted to see colleagues here from the College of Agriculture, Food and Rural Economy, and also from Ulster University, and many of our colleagues from industry. And I know many of our colleagues from those sectors listening and participating online. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Norman Fulton as Deputy Secretary in the Department of Agriculture and Environment and Rural Affairs. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you, Nigel, and good evening, everyone. So I'd just like to start by thanking Queen's University for hosting the event here this evening in these absolutely wonderful surroundings. This lecture, which honours the memory of George Scott Robertson, is a really important and long-standing event in our calendar, and it's thanks to the close working relationship between AFBI, Queen's University, the Ulster Farmers Union and DAERA that we continue to offer this event. To provide a little bit of context to this year's lecture, I've been asked to set out very briefly the key role that science plays in the agri-food policy development and implementation from a DAERA perspective. But before doing that, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Maggie Gill. Maggie is a highly distinguished scientist of international standing who has a unique breadth of understanding of that science policy interface. Perhaps it might be called a dark science. But I very much look forward to what Maggie has to say this evening on delivering change in the agri-food sector, learning from each other. It's a very relevant theme for us all, and timely that Maggie will be able to reflect on the outcomes of COP26 and the recent strategic developments that will shape the direction of the Northern Ireland agri-food system going forward. I think it's probably fair to say that there's never been more important time to have a clear focus on good science to inform decision-making and help deliver and drive change. Our recently published Green Growth Strategy, which is an executive strategy led by the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, is seeking to adopt a holistic approach on how we can play our full part in tackling the climate crisis, whilst also addressing our other environmental challenges and, of course, the need to reshape our economy in a way that benefits everyone. And to that end, science and innovation, alongside education and knowledge exchange, will be major policy instruments on which we will rely heavily to help deliver the goals, and particularly the foundation programmes that sit underneath the Green Growth umbrella. Notably here, our future agricultural policy framework and our Northern Ireland food strategy framework, and of course, our environment strategy as well. So we have an important and a very clear opportunity to embed green growth principles within our decision-making and to ensure that new policies and programmes align with the need to combat climate change, develop green jobs, and to improve our environment. In the coming days, Minister Coates will be issuing for consultation our future agricultural policy proposals for Northern Ireland, and these have been developed through extensive stakeholder engagement and informed by science. and will set out the actions necessary over the coming years to create a sustainable future for agriculture in Northern Ireland. This is very closely aligned with our Northern Ireland Food Strategy Framework, and this has been developed in collaboration with other government departments and other interested parties, and is a complementary framework to our agricultural policy agenda, really seeking to extend issues relating to food production and consumption into other areas of government policy and influence. The vision that we have is of pursuing a transformed food system in Northern Ireland, one that protects natural resources for future generations, is economically and environmentally sustainable, that provides safe, nourishing and accessible food to people who are informed about making healthy choices. So in the time available, I can only give you a feel of some of the policy development currently in progress within the department. There is a lot of it, but the recurring theme throughout is that high quality science is absolutely central to informing, monitoring and evaluating all of our policy initiatives related to green growth for the agri-food sector. Our significant investment in science and innovation across DAERA will be instrumental in delivering these policies and in achieving our objectives. In this, we'll be guided by our science framework and our operational strategies for innovation, for research and development, and for monitoring and surveillance. These latter two are now in their final stages of development, and together, this suite will guide our future approach to identifying, commissioning, and managing our science needs. George Scott Robertson, as we've heard, had a leading role within the Ministry of Agriculture through a time of great change from the 1920s right through to the end of the 1940s. He steered a ministry through many difficult and challenging issues, and in so doing, always recognized the importance of science for good decision-making and the importance of being able to draw on the very best available evidence and science. Here in Northern Ireland, we have all the necessary ingredients, and they have the partners in AFBI, in Queen's University, Ulster University, and in CAFRE, working together to be able to deliver the joined-up science, knowledge transfer, and education that DAERA and our stakeholders require if we are to achieve the vision of a transformed and sustainable food system, helping to address climate emergency, environmental and economic challenges that we currently face in a balanced way and achieve success. And so with that, I pass over to Victor to chair the George Scott Robertson Memorial Lecture for 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, and may I say that I'm honoured to be here, and thanks for the welcome to Professor Nigel Scullin. Climate action is necessary, and every member of society must play their part in tackling this issue. Farmers are up for this challenge. Climate change is affecting every farmer across the globe. Farming is on the front line of climate change impacts, being particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events. So we understand more than most that there is a need to address climate change and to make our farms more resilient to a changing climate. While Northern Ireland must reduce our impact on the climate, we should not reduce our capacity to produce high quality, affordable food produced to high environmental and animal health and welfare standards. Global demand for food is increasing, and according to United Nations forecasts, the number of mouths to feed will rise to nearly 10 billion by 2050. Food security will become increasingly important in a changing climate. COVID-19 clearly outlined how sensitive the food supply chain is to global shocks. The UK Climate Change Risk Assessment report published earlier this year outlined that climate change is likely to exacerbate disruptive events that impact on global agricultural production and food supply chains throughout droughts, storms, pests and diseases, with increased risks of disruptions associated with multiple production areas. In light of the increasing risks to the food supply chain, and particularly around food imports, removing the ability to locally produce high-quality food is irresponsible. Therefore, we must find a way to tackle our emissions and maintain sustainable food production. The UFU is opposed to a forced reduction in livestock numbers. Our livestock industry in Northern Ireland is not up for sale. The UK is only around 60 to 70% self-sufficient on a calorific basis with regards to meat, milk and eggs. There continues to be demand for meat and dairy products. Therefore, the UK and Northern Ireland must not achieve its climate change ambitions by exporting production and our greenhouse gas emissions to other countries, commonly known as carbon leakage. It makes no sense to import product from countries where emissions are higher and standards lower in order to meet climate targets at home. The UFU look forward to collaborating with DAERA to focus on raising awareness about climate issues, highlighting the positive action already underway in Northern Ireland and providing practical on-farm examples of action many of our members can adapt to their own businesses to address the climate change. Our farmers are part of the climate change solution and are committed to tackling the global issue head-on, which is why it's so important to show the many ways they can do this, and we will need the help of science to achieve this. Recently, I was fortunate enough to attend the COP event, where a joint stand was shared with the National Farmers Union, NFU of Scotland and NFU Cymru. We were there to state that UK agriculture is a uniquely versatile sector which supplies food, captures and stores carbon, and helps to generate clean energy. A message which we reiterated alongside our UK farming union counterparts during our visit to COP26. However, we were very disappointed to see how little presence the UK government gave agriculture at the event, considering it's such a crucial part of the jigsaw. There's also, in my estimation, a lost opportunity missed to promote local quality food. Nevertheless, our presence at COP26 was extremely important as we represented our members across Northern Ireland who are already contributing significantly to the UK target of net zero by 2050. And they recognise this can be improved further with the right policy, backed again by that scientific evidence. This is essential to continue making positive progress in combating climate change here in Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole, supporting our local farmers to play their vital part without lessening their ability to produce quality, sustainable products to world-leading standards. At COP, I had the privilege again of chairing the UNFCCC side event, Agriculture Ambition, delivering food security, resilience and mitigation in a changing climate. I did that along with the UK farming unions and agriculture organisations from Germany, Canada and Africa. Discussions there at that event were also had with DAERA Minister Edwin Poots and indeed the Irish Farmers Association President. It was good to see our DAERA Minister there representing Northern Ireland at COP26, and we had further discussions about the need for a climate change bill that supports local farming and food security in Northern Ireland. The DAERA's Minister Bill, which is currently at the scrutiny stage, has taken the advice of the Climate Change Committee on board, proposing a challenging, ambitious but achievable target of reaching at least 82% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in Northern Ireland by 2050, minus the threat of wiping out our agri-food industry in the process, unlike the private member's bill. The UFU are delighted to be involved again in the George Scott Robertson Memorial Lecture. We are looking forward to hear from Professor Maggie Gill, reflect on the outcomes of COP26 and recent strategic developments underpinning the future direction of Northern Ireland's agri-food ecosystem. We're expecting to see a significant period of change in Northern Ireland over the next few years, with the recent announcement of the Green Growth Strategy and the pending consultation on a future agriculture policy. Maggie, we will be interested to hear your thoughts on what direction future policy will and should head. It now falls on me to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Maggie Gill OBE, FRSE, emeritus professor in the School of Biological Science at the University of Aberdeen. From 2014 to 2019, Maggie was chair of the Independent Science and Partnership Council of the CGIAR, a consortium of international agricultural research centres, and chaired an EU think tank for the project Fit for Food 2030, from 2017 to 2020. She currently chairs the Science Advisory Panel of the New Zealand Government's Our Land and Water National Challenge and Sustainable Agriculture and Food Strategy Advisory Panel of the UKRI BBSRC. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Royal Society of Biology, and the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. Maggie was Chief Scientific Advisor for the Environment and Rural Affairs in the Scottish Government from 2006 to 2011, after serving as CEO and Research Director of the Macaulay Institute, one of the predecessors of the James Hutton Institute. She went to the Macaulay after 4 years as CEO of Natural Resources International Limited, a company owned by 4 universities, which was spun out of the privatisation of the Natural Resources Institute, originally part of the UK Government Overseas Development Administration. Maggie has held a number of other titles, including Chair of the Scottish Science Advisory Council, and was awarded the OBE in 2011 for her services to science. Over the years, she has been a researcher, managed research programmes, and advised governments on research, broadening her expertise to interactions between food systems, society, and the environment. Passionate about bringing the policy and science communities closer together to help accelerate the use of knowledge and helping to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, Maggie has a degree in agricultural science from Edinburgh University and a PhD in sheep nutrition from Massey University, New Zealand. I was almost tempted to shorten that to Maggie really knows a thing or two about science. But Maggie, we're delighted to have you here tonight, and we look forward to your talk. And just after that, then we will be opening the floor for questions. Maggie.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation to come here. This is actually my first trip outside Scotland since March 2020, and it was lovely to come over the water. I've been saying to people I'm going on my first overseas trip, and I usually travel, I shouldn't admit this as I'm talking about climate change. I used to travel the world a lot, so they were all expecting that I was going quite far. But I'm pleased to report I came by ferry and bus, because as I said to Elizabeth when we were first discussing this, there's no way I could come and talk about climate change having added to my already high carbon footprint. So I'm delighted to be here, and it was a trip down memory lane for me this morning when I was out at Hillsborough, because what's so far away in my CV is that actually when I started doing research, I was actually researching the intake of silage by sheep initially, and then by dairy cows. So to go out to Hillsborough to smell the silage and to actually look at cows and the monitoring of cows, what I would say is they've got an awful lot more equipment than I had in those days. And small I may be, but I spent many hours shoveling silage first thing in the morning to my various cattle. So that was a trip down memory lane. And then it was lovely over lunch to actually have the chance to talk to some of the postgrads and research fellows. It was just so nice to talk to real people and actually see reactions. And so thanks very much for the invitation for that. So delivering change in the agri-food sector. And I'm actually going to go beyond my experience in agriculture and beyond the agri-food sector, because I think one of the things about the 21st century is very much about how the whole world is interconnected. And if we do one thing, it has an impact elsewhere. And especially climate change, we produce some emissions here and it has an impact across the world. And so you'll find that throughout the talk, I'm going to use quite a lot of quotes, because my training, as you've heard, was in agricultural science. But actually, if I'm going to move into realms beyond my comfort zone or beyond my knowledge zone, then I do like to make sure that I've got them right and I'm attributing them to other people. So just to warn you that that's how it's going to go. So I wanted to start with this. I was lucky too to have a day at COP. I only got into the green zone, and this was what welcomed us to the green zone. And what was nice about that was the opportunity to mix with lots of people who were also thinking of the same challenges. And people sort of said, well, was it depressing? What did you think? Was there positive? There was a really positive buzz in the green zone. And two things I took away from it were, first of all, a big change in the general public awareness of the problems of climate change, and that's vital. And also the big presence of the private sector in the green zone alongside the activists and everyone else. So there were stalls from Sainsbury's and Tesco's, from Scottish Power and SSE on the energy side. And they were really out there making a commitment. And that's what we need. We talk about learning from each other, and it is very much all these different communities learning from each other. But you've already heard a lot about George Scott Robertson, but this is the second named lecture, actually, that I've given this year. And it made me think, so who gets a lecture named after them? What are the commonalities there? And actually, a lot of them are in the sphere that I operate in, agricultural researchers who've turned statesmen. And I'm sorry, ladies, but they're all men as far as I came across. But basically, that made me think, okay, we haven't had any new lectures for a long time. Who are going to be the ones that are actually the lecturers in 100 years' time? Who are the people that are going to be the ones that are remembered? And that made me think, which is sort of sub-theme throughout this, is the role of agricultural research in the transformations that we've heard that we need in the 21st century. My research career started in the 20th century, and the goal was simple: increase milk production. The problems that researchers are facing these days are much more complex. And in fact, it wasn't really until the 1990s that I was asked, that I realized actually that you had to add environment. It wasn't just about increasing food. We did that by having a lot of damage on the environment. And now we need to do much more complex things. So where do those challenges of the 21st century come from? Well, the report that was published in August 2021, the IPCC Working Group report, and this is obviously part of a long series of reports, and those reports have started to, the language in which they were described over the years has got much more serious. Code red was what Antonio Guterres called this. Now, if we see red, we stop at traffic lights. Well, most people do in most countries, not in every country, but code red. It needs radical change. And when it first came out, it was, yes, okay, that was it. But for me, actually from COP and all the media reports on the way up to COP, I think I've persuaded a lot more people that code red means serious change. I'm very glad that the farmers of Northern Ireland have signed up to that. And it means all of us really need to make radical action. And certainly I couldn't have come here and spoken to you and not said that without actually having come on the bus and the ferry, frankly. On the right there, that picture that I just wanted to put up was one of my first realities in terms of climate change. That is the Athabasca Glacier in Western Canada on the Rockies. And that picture was taken over 10 years ago, when already they were worried. Those of you that think about farming in Canada will know that it's the plains to the east of the Rockies that are the breadbasket, and they're fed by the waters from the Athabascan Glacier. That glacier is receding. So the talk earlier, the mention of food security, yeah, because there is a real risk that food security is going to be compromised by climate change. Now, I warned you about lots of quotes that were coming up. And at the start of lockdown, I had to give a talk and I was looking for, okay, so how can we say about the change that needs to happen? And I took this one from Charles Darwin. So often we talk about the survival of the fittest, but actually it's not the strongest, it's not the most intelligent, it's the most adaptable. And that's what we need to do. And that, as you see, was a bit of a theme here, that I always look at something and then ask another question. And that's what I was doing to myself here. So are humans responsive to change? Well, on the surface, yes, because look, the population has doubled. The population of the world has doubled in my lifetime. And we now produce more calories per person on the planet than we did that time. So obviously agricultural research can adapt. But the question now is different. Can we respond fast enough? That was a response over a long period of time, 50, 60 years. And now we only have, as people keep saying, 9 harvests. Although that's not quite right, because in some parts of the world, they have more than 1 harvest a year. So we have to be careful with that one. But we have 9 years, shortly 8 years. And if we don't do something serious then it's just going to be so much worse for all the people that come after. So rapid change, acceleration. And then the second question I would ask, we've heard a lot about how you're going to depend on science. I would caution, yes, absolutely depend on science, because that's what we have. That highlights the risks. And it is advances are showing the opportunities. But as scientists, we should not be arrogant. We do not have all the answers. We do not understand the connections between the oceans and the land in a lot of ways. And there are serious tipping points out there. So my final slide will also refer back to some of the risks of that. And then another question, so the lecturers, or the people that have led to having lectures, have been scientists that have then gone into policy. And the question is, is it the sole responsibility of governments to drive that change? And I would say, no, it's not in the 21st century. Maybe that was science and policy together that helped deliver that increase in total production of food in the past. But where we're headed now is definitely what definitely needs collective action. It needs drastic measures. And that, it's great, therefore, to come here and hear that you are working collectively in Northern Ireland. So, if we start to think about the need for drastic actions, and if we start to think, so as I've said, I like to sort of move across different disciplines, and now that I'm retired, I have the time and the opportunity to read lots of different aspects on this. And I read, this was a quote from The Guardian a week or so ago by a professor of history, moving into unknown territory for me. And when I first read that word that I've explained there under the note 1, I read it as politics. So I read it as that it's not just about politicians, but about the politics of which we are all like it. It's actually polities, which was a new word for me, which is basically the fundamental principles of government. And basically what this history professor was saying is, what I was saying at the end of the last slide, we cannot leave it to government, because if we sign up to a democracy, which we live in, there is no way that government can go too far ahead of the people and the will of the people, because actually they'll be out of government and then we might be worse off than before. And that's some of the benefits of democracy. So therefore, we could never really expect that COP26 was going to come up with drastic actions, because that wasn't feasible in the way that our democracies work. Not like a centralized economy where some of those decisions can actually be made centrally. So that then led me on to look at some of the science, some of the finance that goes with it. If it's not government, and if it's government that it depends on government taking people with them, it also depends in the economies that we live in now, where it's about maximization of profit, and that's how it's looked at. And in fact, the boards of companies have a responsibility to their shareholders to maximize those profits. There's no way that they can actually move ahead and start to compromise that maximization of profit unless the people, unless the government changes some of those little levers in there to make it possible. So this starts to sort of unpick that. How do we move forward? How do we get drastic change? Because we need drastic change. We have to take everyone with us. We have to work together. So intergovernmental pledges were made, 195 or 197 countries that were part of the Conference of the Parties at COP. And they've signed up to things like deforestation and methane emissions. But all they can do about that is change the regulations or legislative change. And interestingly, this article from the Financial Times was then making the point that there's a risk then, is there not, for those who want to invest in agriculture. And I don't know, I'm sure many of you here are aware of the amount of investment there is in agriculture futures, in food futures. There is a lot of investment because people realize that there's something happening there, but there is also a huge risk to agriculture in terms of that. And it's about that balance of trying to keep that money coming in to agriculture to make those sorts of changes. And I'll come back to that later. But as has already been said, food and agriculture were missing from the COP agenda. There was a day on adaptation, there was a day on nature, but there wasn't actually a day on food and agriculture. And when we asked around about that, part of it was because it's highly contentious and there are polarized feelings on it, and 195 countries might well have got stuck if there had been trying to reach some sort of agreement on it. On the other hand, there was a pledge about methane. I'm told that that pledge was largely targeted at the oil and gas industry, and that it is a global reduction of 30%. But there is still, we all need to be making our contribution, and agriculture certainly needs to be making a contribution there. And as a ruminant nutritionist originally, I very much doubt whether the technology, although some exists, to decrease methane production, actually whether it's going to be able to be scaled up to deliver the sorts of changes that we need. But we can come back to that. Now, I wanted to just, I'm not going to say too much more about COP26. I just wanted in the second half of this to talk about two research programs that I've been fortunate enough to be associated with, and to bring to your attention the fact that there are tools there, there are examples there of good practice that you can be looked at. There's a lot of resources, in other words, about how to work collectively. And the first program is called Fit for Food 2030, and it was a project looking at how to change research to deliver the European Food 2030 agenda. And the second one is about our land and water. It's one of the New Zealand government's 11 national science challenges. Fit for Food just happened between 2017 and 2020. The New Zealand one started earlier. As often, the New Zealanders, I think, were ahead in terms of their commitment to working collectively. And it was looking at how the the change from sheep to dairy in New Zealand actually led to a lot of water pollution. So just very briefly, and I've put the links on the slide so it's easy to look at the resources. What Fit for Food 2030 did, it had a number of what were called city labs. They started calling them city labs, and then they belatedly realized actually people in rural areas also need to be involved in this. So they broadened it out in terms of food lab, bringing people together. They met in places like museums, they're still going, and they brought people from different perspectives together. So people from schools, consumers generally, put together with farmers so that there could be a dialogue taking place in a safe space, not in the public eye, and what could you learn about that as to how to make compromises. Then they also had 11 policy labs, and those, again, they discussed things like the policy at a local level, and they discussed, again, trying to bring the different points of view together with a series of tools they had to try and get people who not normally know where their food comes from, understand the constraints on farmers and others. And believe me, that helps in that dialogue and helps away from the confrontation. And then finally, they had an EU think tank, and this is where I came in on this project, that I actually chaired that. And that EU think tank was reporting back to the Commission, to the Standing Committee on Agricultural Research, as to how we thought things could move forward better. So what were the outputs from that? Well, there are a number of resources on the website, and there is also a virtual community which is keeping going, a legacy of the program. But I want to just talk about the game, because I think that's one of the things about dissemination. The project has actually used gaming, youngsters involved in gaming who knew nothing about food, to develop this online game. And the aim of the online game is to provide input on what the public think about different policy options. So if you look up the game developed by these people called Play Decide, then you can actually bring together 4 or 5 people online. And what they actually do is there are cards that tell them about different types of food system. And then there's a discussion about that, and you aim to reach some sort of compromise. What's really interesting about this is all these different players record online what their views are, and then the European Commission, the government, can actually know how the different views are in different countries. So we've heard about consultations that you have, and having been on both sides of consultations, both feeding in and actually looking at the responses to, they leave a lot to be desired, because it's only the people with strong views that will respond to them, whereas actually something like a game may be one of the ways forward for the future. It's just something different worth having a look at. Our land and water, New Zealand, like Northern Ireland, is a country where the consumers are actually overseas. And what they were looking at here, the theory of change, as you see it there, was they're assuming, the hypothesis, that consumers will reward sustainable production. And for New Zealand, that's tricky because it's not your consumers. And it's the same for you folks. You have to look elsewhere and think. So again, I just put this up. You've got some of the same problems, I understand, with water pollution, etc. There's a lot to be learned from this. And it's very much involved industry from the start, co-design. And I went to, sorry to confess, I did fly to New Zealand a few years ago. I was very taken by one farmer there who was attending. We had a conference with lots of farmers in the audience as well as the scientists. And one farmer was talking about how he sat on his autonomously driven tractor on a Zoom call to some of the scientists while he was actually doing it. And so, again, I think farmers that are ahead on the technology, really doing things differently, listening to that science, like you're saying is happening here. So again, just another example that's online of the things that you can look at and pick up from. So what are my key messages from these two examples? Transformation, everybody signed up to it across, well, not everybody, but a lot of recognition across the world that transformation of food and agriculture is absolutely essential if we're going to be able to keep a good quality of life for generations to come. Systems approaches, thinking broadly, thinking more widely, thinking outside the box, thinking laterally. Look outside for some of those solutions. A lot of the solutions are coming from things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, technology advances. A lot of the things that in the food and agriculture sector, some of them come from space exploration. We need to think broadly. We need to bring those in. Multiple stakeholders need to be involved from the beginning. You've got to get the research questions you ask right for the way in which that research will be taken up. It's absolutely key that the people, the users are going to be involved in the design if you're looking for that impact that is required. Flexibility. We're not God, as I've already said, science doesn't have all the answers. We don't get everything right. We should learn to put up our hands and say that, and we should learn to be flexible, say something's wrong and change it. And we shouldn't be in a blame game of saying you got it, science got it wrong, this got it wrong. Surely COVID has taught us we need to be adaptable, flexible, and put our hands up if things are wrong. Training. It's a different way of doing research. And it's different for farmers, I think, to be so much more involved in research. But that's what's needed. And that doesn't just come naturally. We don't have long. We only have till 2030 to make significant changes and reduce all those gases up there. So therefore training together, probably, of how to actually go about that. And there are tools out there fit for food with some of those. So those tools exist. However, one thing that didn't really come up so much in what I've described of those, but has come up earlier in some of the earlier introductions to this, is the importance of monitoring and measuring. Change depends on local actions, and too much of what we see, certainly in the agriculture literature, are global averages. You think about 1.5 degrees, that's the limit. Well, that 1.5 degrees that everybody's talked about is a global average. I mean, it's already a bigger change at the poles. The North and the South Pole, sorry, that has multiple meanings there. So we need to really think, are we measuring things locally? Is the cows, individual cows that produce methane, are we getting enough of those measurements? And I was very impressed today to actually see that there is equipment to actually do that. We need to be measuring those local actions. And measuring the gases of any form locally is very difficult. But those are the sorts of things we need to understand more clearly. And also, we need to accept that actions taken on climate change may have an impact, a negative impact, on our other emergency at the moment, biodiversity. And if we just focus on climate change without thinking of those unintended consequences, we're in trouble. And one of the key things, certainly in the Scottish debates on all of this, is climate justice. We really need to think who are going to suffer from some of these actions. And particularly, and climate justice was a big thing in COP. There were a lot of sessions on it, there was a lot of talk about it. And in the Scottish media, and certainly the Scottish government, very much signed up to, we need to keep our eyes open to see who is suffering. Now, in COP, a lot of it was about developing countries and the need for money for developing countries. They haven't actually contributed that much to climate change. And indeed, they don't have the money to pay for it. So we do need to pay for it, but we should not forget that also in our own countries, people are going to suffer. Food prices go up. A lot of people already, we've seen in COVID times, food banks much more used. So we need to be thinking about climate justice. And therefore, we need to be monitoring not just those direct impacts, but the indirect ones. So choice of indicators is absolutely key. So moving to the end, future context. The future is uncertain, not just due to climate change. There's also shifting geopolitics. We've seen enough about that, where China comes in and a potential in other countries, and the shift in an axis there, and also our interconnected economy. We saw that during the lockdowns last year and earlier this year. More shocks like COVID are almost inevitable, probably are inevitable. And science has suggested, remember I said science has a responsibility to highlight risks and provide opportunities. And science is very clear there are tipping points. I've looked at some rather worrying webinars, certainly about the North Atlantic circulation. And just think what that would do to your country and mine if that was actually to shift. And the risk goes up and down in relation to that. Nobody can predict. There's been a lot less work done on ocean measurements than there has on terrestrial measurements, and we need to just be alert to that. But on the other hand, COP demonstrated public opinion is changing. And what I've also mentioned about the need for money, the finance sector. Mark Carney reckons there's 123 trillion. And I've finally trained myself to say trillion as a first off. There is a lot of money out there that could be used to solve some of these problems. And it is about part of the role of governance is to government and policy is to actually make some of those investments financially attractive in relation to how our economy currently works. Collaboration, George Scott Robertson, researcher, and then into policy. Now, I think we very definitely need to move beyond that. We need to get business. And if we're going to get government to change, we also need to get those consumer communities changing as well. But on the plus, they are changing, and also advances in technology. And what I saw today at Hillsborough, with all those different bits of equipment that you've got, great. We need that, and we need more of that. And we need to be able to analyze all of that. So going back to our person in whose name this is, agricultural research in the next generation, in the 21st century, is not just about agriculture and policy. We need to understand that complexity. We need to forecast scenarios. But agriculture research can provide those tools, provide the glue that brings these different communities together. But my final word is, don't be afraid to admit if something's going wrong. If we don't, and we actually keep going down, producing more greenhouse gases, or you're like me and you don't listen about flying and you keep flying, you're adding to the problems. And we should be prepared to own up to it, to change it. And we need, because we still have a lot to learn. So that modesty that was referred to in George Scott Robertson, we need more of that, because we need to be able to say, we're not getting this right yet, but we can do it. And science and policy, and even some of the activists say, we've still got time to make those changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. We come to our question time now, and for those of you that are online, if you want to type your questions in or put the questions up. So we'll open it up to this floor first to see if there's any questions out there. Thank you for an inspiring talk, and undoubtedly it's a complex subject, and we've got a lot out of you tonight. So Any questions? John, we'll get a mic to you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Thank you for a stunning lecture, as always. I've had the pleasure of listening to you several times. The one area you maybe didn't delve in overly deeply about, and it's an area I feel our sector is not good at, is actually understanding cultural barriers to change. I've always said that our knowledge toolbox is probably 70% full, but actually learning to change our behavior, we probably only know about 30%. What role do you feel there are for social science in helping us in actually getting this transformational change?
Great question. And just, I'll try and be brief in my answers so I can cope with more questions. Just two things that I would say. So when I was showing the Our Land and Water, there were some Maori words in that. And one of the key things about Our Land and Water, and in fact, New Zealand more generally, is an acceptance that the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, have a different approach to land and water than the Pakeha or the European settlers actually do. And what I've seen in my recent visits to New Zealand is a huge change and acceptance of that. There's a huge cultural change in New Zealand towards accepting that the indigenous people have rights there and that their culture should be more prominent. The second point I would make about culture is there is a lot of social science literature about the culture of meat eating. And if you go back in time, then there's a long history, obviously, of the human race and meat eating, which I talk at length on, but that's not time for that. But there is something about meat which is different to milk, actually, because when you look at people, it's all about like meat-free Mondays or vegetarianism, which is it's decreasing meat, and there's been a lot less focus on the dairy side for a variety of reasons. I think there's things we could learn from that as to how to change it. And part of it is actually meat consumption I think it's in Europe has decreased 17% in the last, it's on the way down. If you read the newspapers, you'd never think that. And actually, the media have a big role to play, I think, in raising the point. This is not abrupt, sudden change. This is sort of something now, as a farmer, you may not think meat consumption should go down. The point I would make is, I would totally protect the opportunity to make profits from farming. I'm not entirely sure I equate making profits with keeping the same livestock numbers. I think there are nuances in this which we should discuss openly and reach an agreement on what works for the common goal. And the common goal is that people should have economies, there should be livelihoods, you should be able to make money off the land, absolutely. But at the same time, we all have to do something on climate change. So it's much more discussion. And that's where I think research, numbers, data can actually facilitate that discussion, provided I don't blame you for providing the methane and you don't blame me for eating slightly less meat.
Yeah, well, I'll maybe come into that. Look, we're not asking you to eat more meat, Maggie, and you know, we want to produce the same output from less. I don't know a farmer out there that wouldn't enjoy making the same income out of less. So really it's about outputs, but we have to balance that with a world population that's growing. And that population has to be it. So you can eat a little bit less, but there's maybe two of you now, where there used to be just one of you. So,
well, we can discuss that one over dinner.
Have we any questions on this online? No. Have we another question here on the floor anywhere? Yes, over here too.
Thank you very much. You mentioned there about Mark Carney and the finance that's available. Have you any thoughts about how research, government, industry unlock that finance in the next number of years?
So I think one of the key things there is for, and again, I see research as the glue. And I think, as you all know, and there's no doubt you represent, is huge heterogeneity, huge diversity within a farming sector in terms of the size of farms, the different type of land you've got, the weather, all the things that you have, there's things that change. It's very difficult, I think, for people on the policy side to be able to cover that huge diversity in terms of how do you come out with a policy that's going to work for everyone. And I think what research can do is help people in policy understand that diversity and what it means. And it's sort of engaging in that debate a lot more, I think. So I like the concept that tools, I used to develop research models myself. I think those models, I'm highly skeptical about a lot of the models, but they provide a platform for dialogue, and it's that dialogue that needs to take place. And now that we can all operate virtually, and we have so many people online tonight, it's much easier with that to get that dialogue going, I think. So dialogue, 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 and research providing a lot of the basis for that is how I see it.
Yeah.
Sorry, that doesn't quite answer the question in terms of, so how do we unlock it? We help the government to come up with policies that enable that investment to fit with maximising profit, which is how our economies work. And talking to, so I'm not a financier, obviously, but if you talk to some of the financiers, they have really good ways of explaining it, how it's just slight tweaks in some of that could actually unlock that money. But those tweaks have to be based on an understanding of the industry.
Yeah, I suppose that's something we in the UFU do on a daily basis. We try to unlock finances. And when you have some of our industry buyers, be it milk or be it beef in the audience here, and we have government here, we have quite a challenge. Any more questions from the audience before we?
Victor, Victor, we have two typed questions. Yes. If you can see them on the screen, but if you like, I can read it to you.
Please read that, please.
Okay, so the first question is from Simon Heath. You imply that politicians won't move very quickly because of the elections, and industry won't move very quickly.
I can't actually hear that.
Sorry, the sound's not terribly good.
It's from Simon Heath. So, Maggie, the question is, you implied that politicians won't move very quickly because of the elections, and industry won't move very quickly because of dividend. But we have to move very quickly if we are to meet the challenge of 2030. Will we meet 2030?
Yes, would be because we have to. I mean, if you start with a defeatist attitude, you haven't got a hope of getting anywhere really. So we have to believe, and lots of the people who are providing the evidence say, yes, we can. But it's things like, as John raised, it's behaviour change. How do we get that? And it's also a willingness of everybody to actually make changes. And one of the best bits of advice that I've heard came from a teenager, and it was what needs to change. It's minds that need to change. And the recommendation was that every morning, first thing when you wake up, you spend 2.5 minutes. I'm not sure where the 2.5 minutes came from, but you think, what am I going to do today? And everything that I'm going to do in that day, how can I cut my carbon? And it's things like, I don't know, in Scotland, we had this thing about, one of the things you can do is turn off the water while you clean your teeth. You may think that's a silly one, but if everybody actually did it and we used less water, there would be less costs, electricity costs, chemical costs of actually treating that water. Everything we do has a cost in there. So if we think about everything and each of us do it, it multiplies up. So if we can get that momentum going and get everybody actually thinking of that, yes, we can do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think some of my colleagues down there will be smiling. One of my favorite things was, how do you eat an elephant? When you don't look at the elephant, you just start bite by bite by bite. And the key is to thinking that every little thing that you do has an effect, and then the cumulative effect of all those little things achieves great things.
Agreement between science and farming, you see.
Do you want to take another from the screen, or have we one more on the floor? So our time has left us. We're actually over time a little. So unless there's any burning questions from the floor, yeah, one from George Mullen, and then that'll do.
I think part of the thing is that for those online, those questions would be forwarded to me, and I'm happy to respond to them.
Yes, those questions that are written in. So if you're back at home and want to type in a question, continue typing in, and Maggie will respond to them. But George, last word to you before I ask.
Elizabeth.
To close up. The Boris moment. George.
My question is simple. Are other industries as engaged in this discussion as agriculture is?
Some more so. I mean, I live in Aberdeenshire, near to the oil and gas centre of Europe, it was once called, of Aberdeen. And a lot of my neighbours are oil and gas, and they also have guilty consciences from the past. There's Ian Wood in Aberdeen has set up something called Opportunity Northeast. And what he's doing, I mean, you may think farmers have it tough, oil and gas is going to disappear. And their focus is on opportunities for training for people to move into different industries there. Now, we can't just stop oil and gas overnight. And I argue very firmly for the livestock sector, saying we cannot stop livestock we should not have any abrupt shocks on livestock, because livestock contribute 40% of global agricultural GDP. Any change has to be in a transition. Some other sectors are at more of a cliff edge. Yes. In terms of they will come to an end, like coal in UK did, and now it's going to happen elsewhere. So yes, lots of sectors are, and they were very predominant, I think, in the green zone as well, the energy sector.
Yes, Maggie, and one of the things I picked out of your talk was that you did mention the relationship we have with biodiversity, and sometimes I think if we focus too much on carbon, we let something else slip. So it's again keeping that broad thing. Over to Professor Elizabeth McGowan. Thank you. To close, we'll just stay for that.
Thank you, Victor. So going from forgetting my name to elevating me to Professor, that's very good. But I'm glad you didn't follow with your Boris moment and call me Pippa Pig. So no, thank you, everybody. It's been a really fantastic evening, and great to have you here in the Great Hall, and indeed to have our colleagues online as well for the 61st George Scott Robertson Lecture, delivered by the very professional Professor Maggie Gill. I'm really delighted to have you here this evening. I was tempted to get a t-shirt, Be Like Maggie, because she has really led, by example tonight in her behavioural change to come from Aberdeen by bus and ferry. Did take her 3 days, but the 3-day return trip, but she did get here, and delighted to have you here. So this being our first hybrid event, I hope everybody has had a good experience. As Victor said at the start, Maggie certainly does know a thing or two about science, and indeed she, as I say, she very much brought the behavioural change here tonight and led by example in coming here in the lowest carbon route possible. She's also, I think, as far as we can recall, the first lady to present the George Scott Robertson Lecture. So she noted some statesmen in her talk, but I know that Maggie's breaking ground as a stateswoman for sure. So some key points that she covered just on reflection. She reminded us tonight that we are code red for humanity, as called out by the IPPC earlier this year. And therefore, Maggie emphasised throughout her talk the urgency that's needed. We only have 9 years. And as you were saying there at the end, can we make 2030? Yes, we can, because we just have to. Now, science will assess the risks and will also offer opportunities and solutions, but really to achieve what we need to achieve by 2030 and beyond is going to be essential that we collaborate It's not the sole responsibility of government. It's not the sole responsibility of industry or society or science. It's those components all coming together. And indeed, economy, very importantly, coming together alongside all of that. Maggie and Victor also highlighted disappointment that at COP, agriculture and food wasn't as predominant as what you would have expected it to be. And Maggie, you suggested that that was probably because it was just such a contentious issue. And I think on reflection, that's probably the fact that global governments appreciate the importance of agriculture and food around the planet and what it delivers for society, and also the challenge that it is to decarbonise it. So in one way, I take that as a positive that there's so much debate still to be had and trying to work that through. Maggie, you gave some excellent examples on projects of how people can learn together, and the Fit for Food project in particular, which used the gaming, talking to the next generation. I've often wondered, how can we tap into that mentality of Facebook and the gaming games that my daughter and son absolutely love? But we've got it, that's the next generation. How can we, older folk, actually understand that and learn from it? So that was an excellent example you shared with us tonight. Thank you. Overall, Maggie's key messages were that the food system must transform, but we need to take a whole systems approach and really think outside the box, looking to other sectors, even the space sector. It must be a multidisciplinary stakeholder approach. And training is so fundamentally important in all of this, to learn and think about new ways of working and new systems being brought in. And another important point that you called out a couple of times is around the flexibility and success. In other words, don't be afraid to fail. And don't be afraid that if something isn't working right, to change it, to stop and change. So in conclusion, the future is uncertain, not least because of climate change, but also because of potential future pandemics, public perception, and indeed, the pressures on the financial sector. But there is real chance and real optimism there, and real reason for optimism, because we just have to achieve what we need to achieve in 2030. And Maggie, I was delighted to hear, your call for more equipment at Hillsborough. We'll send you some of the business cases and to take note, those who need to. But I'm glad you enjoyed your trip out to Hillsborough this morning and what's going on there and within the Queen's and AFBI Alliance. And indeed, working further with CAFRE and UU and our colleagues in industry and government, we really do hope to achieve real transformational change here in Northern Ireland. So folks, don't be afraid to admit something isn't working and change it. That was Maggie's concluding slide. So Maggie, thank you so much for your time tonight, your efforts and your excellent presentation. Very much appreciated. Thank you.